Boris had a problem that no bear should ever have. He couldn't sleep. This wouldn't be particularly unusual for a human, or a cat, or an owl who was supposed to be awake at night anyway. But Boris was a bear, a large, brown, perfectly healthy bear who was biologically programmed to sleep for 6 months straight every winter. And he absolutely could not do it. It was November 3rd, which meant hibernation season had officially started 3 days ago, and while all the other bears in the forest were tucked into their cozy dens, snoring peacefully through the beginning of winter, Boris was wide awake, staring at the ceiling of his cave, counting sheep. He'd gotten to 4,372 sheep before he realized that counting sheep was probably not helping, especially since he'd accidentally started imagining them doing increasingly complex activities. Right now, sheep number 4,373 was operating a small bakery, and sheep number 4,374 was its only customer, and they were having a disagreement about the price of croissants. "This is ridiculous," Boris said out loud to his empty cave. "I'm a bear. Sleeping is literally my main skill. It's what I'm known for. Sleeps like a bear is a saying, and I can't do the one thing I'm supposed to be famous for." He rolled over, tried a different position. Maybe he was lying wrong. Maybe bears had a special hibernation position he'd forgotten about. He tried lying on his back, too vulnerable. On his stomach, couldn't breathe properly. On his left side, his right arm fell asleep, which was ironic because the rest of him absolutely did not. After an hour of experimental positions, including one where he was somehow balanced on his head with his legs against the cave wall, he wasn't sure how he'd gotten into that position and was even less sure how to get out of it. Boris gave up. He dragged himself out of his cave and into the cold November night. The forest was absolutely silent. Every sensible bear was asleep. Every sensible squirrel was asleep. Even the owls, who were supposed to be awake, looked judgmentally sleepy. Boris trudged through the forest, his paws crunching on frost-covered leaves, until he came to a tree where a small owl named Herbert was perched, looking half asleep and very annoyed at being conscious. "Herbert," Boris called up, "I need help." Herbert opened one eye. "Boris? What are you doing awake? It's November. You should be hibernating." "I know I should be hibernating," Boris said, trying not to sound too desperate, "but I can't sleep. I've tried everything. Counting sheep, warm milk, well, I imagined warm milk because I'm lactose intolerant, meditation, those breathing exercises the yoga rabbit told me about. Nothing works." Herbert blinked slowly, which was his version of extreme concern. "Have you tried just closing your eyes and waiting?" "For 6 hours, Herbert, 6 hours!" Herbert said thoughtfully. "That is concerning. Have you considered that maybe you're not actually a bear?" Boris stared at him. "What?" "Maybe you're actually a very large, confused dog. Dogs don't hibernate." "Herbert, I'm a bear. I've been a bear my entire life. I have all the bear characteristics. Look, I can even do the bear thing." Boris stood up on his hind legs and made what he thought was an impressive bear noise, but it came out more like a wheeze because he was tired and stressed. "That sounded more like a broken accordion," Herbert observed. "Not helping, Herbert." "Have you tried asking the other bears for advice?" "They're all asleep, Herbert. That's the whole point. That's what they're supposed to be doing. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. Instead, I'm out here having an existential crisis with an owl at 2 in the morning." Herbert ruffled his feathers thoughtfully. "You should go see Margaret." "Who's Margaret?" Margaret the hedgehog. She's a sleep therapist. Well, she's not officially certified, but she read a book about it once, and she's very confident. Boris was desperate enough to try anything at this point. Where can I find her? Follow the path toward the creek, then turn left at the mushroom circle. Her burrow is under the twisted oak tree. But be quiet when you knock. She gets very irritable if you wake her up, which is ironic given her profession. And so Boris set off through the dark forest, following Herbert's directions, until he found himself standing in front of a small burrow under a gnarled oak tree. There was a tiny wooden sign next to the entrance that read, "Margaret Sleep Solutions, by appointment only, no walk-ins," in very aggressive handwriting. Boris knocked gently on the tree root above the burrow entrance. Nothing happened. He knocked a little louder. Still nothing. He was about to knock a third time when a very grumpy voice came from inside the burrow. "Can you read? The sign clearly says no walk-ins, and it's the middle of the night. Some of us are trying to sleep." "I'm so sorry," Boris said quickly, "but I desperately need help. I'm a bear and I can't hibernate, and it's been 3 days and I'm going insane, and an owl named Herbert sent me, and please, please help me." There was a long silence, then a shuffling sound, then the smallest, grumpiest hedgehog Boris had ever seen emerged from the burrow, wearing tiny reading glasses and what appeared to be a miniature robab. "You're a bear," Margaret said flatly. "Yes. And you can't sleep." "Correct. It's November." "I'm aware." Margaret sighed deeply, which was impressive for someone so small. "Come with me, but quietly. If you wake up my neighbor Gerald, he'll never let me hear the end of it. He's a very light sleeper, which is rich coming from a dormouse whose entire existence revolves around sleeping." Boris followed Margaret into a small clearing where she had set up what appeared to be an outdoor office. There was a tiny desk made from bark, a small lantern, and several leaves with notes written in tiny, precise handwriting. "Sit," Margaret commanded, pointing at a spot on the ground. Boris sat, feeling enormous and awkward next to the miniature furniture. Margaret pulled out a leaf and a small twig that she was apparently using as a pen. "Let's start with the basics. When did this problem begin?" 3 days ago. "Well, technically it started last year, but I thought it was just a one-time thing." "You've had insomnia for an entire year, and you're only seeking help now?" Margaret looked at him over her tiny glasses with an expression that made Boris feel about 2 inches tall, which was quite a feat considering he was a full-grown bear. "I thought I could handle it myself," Boris mumbled. "I didn't want to be a bother." "You're a bear who can't hibernate. That's like a fish who can't swim, or a bird who's afraid of heights. This is a crisis, Boris. This requires immediate intervention." Margaret began scribbling notes furiously on her leaf. "Tell me about your bedtime routine." "My what?" "Your bedtime routine. What do you do before trying to hibernate?" Boris thought about it. "Well, I eat a lot of food in October. That's pretty standard bear protocol. Then on November 1st, I go into my cave, lie down, and try to sleep." "That's it?" Margaret looked horrified. "You don't have any sleep hygiene practices? No wind-down routine? No relaxation techniques?" "I'm a bear," Boris said defensively. "We don't need routines. We just eat and then sleep. It's a very simple system that has worked for thousands of years of bear evolution." "Clearly, it's not working for you," Margaret pointed out. "We need to establish a proper hibernation routine. Let me ask you this. What's your cave like?" "It's a cave. It's dark. It's rocky. There's some moss in the corner that I've been meaning to clean up, but haven't gotten around to. Margaret made a note. Is it comfortable? Define comfortable. Boris, if you have to ask me to define comfortable, the answer is no. She tapped her twig thoughtfully. When was the last time you cleaned your cave? Do bears typically clean their caves? The successful hibernators do. I feel like you're making that up. I'm a licensed sleep therapist, Margaret said with absolute confidence. Well, unlicensed, technically, but very experienced. Trust me. Boris was starting to wonder if this was a mistake, but he'd come this far. Okay, fine. What should I do? Margaret stood up, which didn't make much of a height difference, but seemed to make her feel more authoritative. First, we're going to your cave. I need to assess the situation personally. Then, we're going to create the optimal hibernation environment. This is going to be a complete sleep intervention. It's 4 a.m, Boris pointed out. Exactly. We have plenty of time before sunrise. Let's go. And so Boris led Margaret back to his cave, with the tiny hedgehog marching determinedly beside him, occasionally stopping to make notes on various leaves she'd stuffed into her bathrobe pockets. When they arrived at Boris's cave, Margaret stood at the entrance, looked inside, and was silent for a very long moment. Boris, she finally said, have you considered that maybe you can't sleep because your cave looks like a tornado had a fight with a landslide? Boris looked at his cave, trying to see it through fresh eyes. There were leaves scattered everywhere, several pine cones he'd been collecting for reasons he couldn't remember, a pile of fish bones in the corner from last spring, what appeared to be a family of mice living in the moss. And was that a bird's nest on the ceiling? I've been busy, Boris said weakly. Busy doing what? You're supposed to be sleeping. Margaret took a deep breath, adjusted her tiny glasses, and rolled up her metaphorical sleeves. Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, we clean everything. Then we're going to create a proper sleeping area with adequate moss distribution. Then we're going to address your anxiety about hibernation, which is clearly the underlying issue here. I don't have anxiety, Boris protested. Boris, you just spent 6 hours imagining an entire economy based on sheep bakeries. You have anxiety. For the next several hours, Boris and Margaret cleaned the cave. Well, Boris did most of the cleaning, while Margaret supervised and occasionally shouted instructions. They removed the bird's nest. The bird family had already migrated south anyway. They disposed of the fish bones. The mice were disappointed, but understanding. They organized the pine cones into a neat pile. Boris still wasn't sure why he was collecting them, but they looked nice, organized. They fluffed up the moss, they swept away old leaves and brought in fresh ones. They even found a flat rock that Margaret declared would make an excellent meditation stone for pre-hibernation relaxation. By the time they finished, the sun was starting to rise and Boris's cave looked, actually, pretty good. Cozy, even. There, Margaret said, surveying their work with satisfaction. This is a proper hibernation space. Now let's talk about your anxiety. I told you, I don't have... Boris, Margaret fixed him with a stern look. Why do you think you can't sleep? Boris was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, What if I miss something? Miss something? While I'm sleeping? What if something important happens and I'm not there for it? What if there's an emergency? What if my friends need me? What if I wake up and the whole world has changed and I don't recognize anything anymore? Margaret's expression softened. Oh, Boris, that's what this is about. Boris felt suddenly embarrassed. I know it's stupid. I'm a bear. Bears hibernate. It's what we do. But every year when it's time to sleep, I just panic. All I can think about is all the things I'll miss, all the sunrises I won't see, all the conversations I won't have, all the life that will keep happening without me. It's not stupid, Margaret said gently. She climbed up onto a rock so she could look Boris in the eye. Really? And here's something else to consider. Sleep isn't nothing. Dreams aren't nothing. Rest isn't nothing. When you hibernate, you're not absent from the world, you're just experiencing it differently. Your body is healing, your mind is processing. You're preparing for the next part of your story. That's not missing out, that's participating in a different way. Boris thought about this. I never thought of it that way. Most insomniacs don't. They think of sleep as loss of time instead of as its own kind of experience. Margaret hopped down from her rock. Now, let's practice some relaxation techniques. I want you to lie down in your newly organized sleeping area. Boris lay down on the fresh moss. It was actually quite comfortable. Good. Now close your eyes. Boris closed his eyes. Now, I want you to imagine the forest, but not as it is right now. Imagine it in spring. Imagine yourself waking up after a long, peaceful hibernation. The sun is warm, the flowers are blooming, everything is new and fresh and full of possibility. That's what you're sleeping toward, not away from life, but toward it. Boris thought about it. He could almost smell the spring flowers, almost feel the warm sunshine, almost hear the birds returning from their southern migration. That's good, Margaret said softly. Now just breathe. In and out, slowly. Let yourself feel heavy. Let yourself sink into the moss. Let yourself trust that the he world will keep turning while you rest. Let yourself believe that you deserve this peace. Boris breathed. In and out. In and out. The cave was quiet, comfortable, safe. His body felt heavy in a good way. His mind felt calm. For the first time in days, actually calm. I think, Boris said sleepily, I think it's working. Of course it's working, Margaret whispered. I read a book about this. Now stop talking and sleep. And incredibly, impossibly, Boris felt himself drifting off, not anxiously, not restlessly, but gently, peacefully, naturally. The last thing he heard was Margaret's tiny footsteps as she tiptoed out of the cave, followed by her voice, barely audible, "Sleep well, Boris. See you in spring." And Boris did sleep. He slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first few days, his body finally getting the rest it desperately needed. Then his dreams came, and they were beautiful. He dreamed of spring meadows, and summer berries, and autumn leaves, and next winter's snow. He dreamed of his friends, and his forest, and his life. He dreamed of time passing like a gentle river, carrying him safely from one season to the next. Outside his cave, winter came in full. Snow covered the forest. Icicles hung from trees. The other bears slept in their dens. The hedgehogs burrowed deep underground. The owls hunted in silent, snowy nights. And in a tiny burrow under a twisted oak tree, Margaret the hedgehog added one more note to her collection of leaves. Boris the bear, successful hibernation achieved. Patient learned that rest is not absence, but presence in a different form. Recommend continued practice. Bill sent for consultation, 3 pine cones and acknowledgement of professional expertise. She smiled to herself, adjusted her tiny reading glasses, and went back to sleep. Above ground, the world kept turning. The stars kept shining. The moon kept waxing and waning. The seasons kept changing. And Boris the bear kept sleeping, finally at peace with the idea that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself rest. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust that life will wait for you. Sometimes the best way to participate in the world is to step back from it for a while, knowing you'll return when you're ready. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the flowers bloomed, the birds returned, and one warm April morning, Boris opened his eyes, stretched his enormous bare body, and walked out of his cave into the sunshine. He felt rested, really truly rested. He felt ready for whatever came next. He made his way through the forest to the twisted oak tree and knocked gently on the root above Margaret's burrow. A sleepy voice called out, "It's spring, so I suppose walk-ins are acceptable now. Come in." Boris couldn't fit in the burrow, so Margaret came out, yawning and stretching her tiny legs. "Boris, you look well rested." "I am well rested," Boris said, and he realized it was true. "Thank you, Margaret. You saved my life." "I sent you a bill. 3 pine cones." "I can have 100 pine cones," Boris said. "I still don't know why I was collecting them, but they're all yours." Margaret smiled. "Keep them. You might need them for next winter. Speaking of which, how do you feel about hibernation now?" Boris thought about it. "Less scared. I think I understand now that sleep isn't something to fear. It's just part of the cycle, part of being alive." "Good," Margaret said. "That's very good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 17 other patients with various sleep issues. Apparently, there's a squirrel who keeps waking up in the middle of the night, convinced he's forgotten where he buried his nuts, and a rabbit with recurring nightmares about vegetables." "Good luck," Boris said. "Thank you. And Boris, same time next November?" "Absolutely," Boris promised, and he meant it. As Boris walked back through the spring forest, he felt lighter than he had in years, not just because he'd slept well, but because he'd learned something important. That rest wasn't weakness, that sleep wasn't surrender, that sometimes the bravest, most necessary thing you could do was simply close your eyes and trust that you'd wake up to a new day. He spent the spring and summer doing bear things, eating berries, swimming in streams, napping in sunny meadows, and now, finally, those naps came easily. Making friends, living fully. And when November came around again, Boris didn't panic. He cleaned his cave. He arranged his moss. He said goodbye to his friends. And he went to sleep, peaceful and unafraid, knowing that spring would come again, and he would be there to meet it. Sleep well, like Boris, finally at peace with rest.